Hi, this is Gregory Luth with Adoptees United Inc., and this is a video replay of a March 21st, 2021 event called Unsealed, Petitioning the Court for Records. It features Rudy Owens, Courtney Humbaugh, and myself. It starts with Rudy Owens, and unfortunately I forgot to hit the record button at the very beginning of the event, and so it begins somewhat at the very beginning of Rudy Owens' presentation. Apologies for that, but we'll do better next time. Thanks.
The Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which is particularly difficult to navigate and to work with in its treatment of adoptees. I also am a little unique in that I also changed my name. So I incorporated both of my birth name and my original name into a new name, which is now Rudolph Scott Douglas Owens. So I actually have a third official birth certificate, and that birth certificate incorporates that, but if you even look at it, it incorporates lies that's stating that there are birth facts on file. They're actually not true birth facts. So this is just part of the evidence of a system which is promoting misinformation and even has disinformation in its official documentation of who we are and documents that are being withheld from people who are adoptees. Another thing which I really think is important for understanding my court petition process and others who may have gone through these similar journeys is that I self-identify as a bastard. And bastard actually is a very precise term. It's a term that defines people by law. It's a term that has been defined sociologically, globally, throughout history, across nearly all cultures, about people who are legitimate and illegitimate. And because of my status being born into this category of person, I am being denied legal rights. And because of the denial of those rights, I've actually had to go through processes which no person should have to endure. And so one of the things that I want to do is to help others who are forced to basically go through this process, things like petitioning the court, which they should never have to do. So I basically want people to understand that going to a court and petitioning the court is a reflection of being a bastard. Others who have been working on this much longer than I have stated that adoptees are bastardized by the state. I would argue that what Michigan does to its adoptees, particularly those, as Greg born into the donut hole years, which are the most restrictive, is they make it nearly impossible for anyone in those boom years of adoption to access their original birth record. The other thing which I want to point out, which I pointed out when I wrote my book describing this process, again, the court petition process is not meant to be equitable. It's not meant to be fair. It's a reflection of larger legal inequity that many in this conversation are working to change through legislative reform. And those in New York had a big win. And my greatest congratulations to all those in New York and nationally who contributed to that. So again, when we talk about a court petition process, we just have to really place it in this context of larger inequity. And one thing which I have done is I put together some FAQs that were never put together by the courts or by the state of Michigan, trying to help people navigate this process. And one of the things that I try to explain on my resources, which are meant to be available to everybody out there, is that the entire system and the legal system is not meant to provide you access to your records. The entire system is meant to prevent you from getting those records. In the case of Michigan, I'm going to argue that the entire purpose is to prevent you from ever getting those records with as many obstacles as possible. And for whatever reason, I was able to overcome that, and there's multiple reasons for that, but it's a reflection of the fact that they want to deny adoptees records, and there is almost no data to document it. And I have worked to try to release the data, and it's not being shared. And that's outlined a bit in my PowerPoint. Another thing I just want to share before we get going also is that I am just one person who's been a part of a larger movement that has been going on for decades. You know, as far back as the 1970s, people have been advocating that the obtaining of a original birth certificate is a basic human right. So this is long work done by many before me. I'm just one of many who has been working on this. And so what I'm hopefully have done through at least telling my story and sharing my story, particularly with the online resources, is that we are basically part of a national movement, and this national movement relies on people like yourselves getting together and working for advocacy. And hopefully, the telling of these stories today are going to be a part of making that information more available. And I can sort of park it there and get into the process later. Greg?
Thanks, Rudy. And just a couple things to mention too. Rudy represented himself in court, right?
Yep.
And then Courtney, which we'll talk to here, she'll introduce herself briefly here in a minute, but Courtney hired an attorney. And then I'm sort of both. I've represented myself in court in DC, but I represent Minnesota-born adoptees in Minnesota. So I kind of have both perspectives. So I'm really excited to hear also from Courtney in just a sec. The other thing I forgot to mention is that we are recording today's presentation. It's so I make sure people are aware of that in case that makes a difference for them in speaking up. Sometimes we have intercountry adoptees whose legal status is not secure. And so I want to make sure that if that is the case with anyone, or if there are any other reasons you don't want to be recorded, you can certainly turn your video off. And I just want to make sure that we provide that acknowledgement in advance.
You can also change your name, or if you need, or your phone number for people who have phone numbers. Since it is being recorded, you might want to just go into your settings and change that if you need to as well.
And so our next introduction, and then again, we're going to come back to Rudy and we're going to come back to Courtney to get into more details over the sort of the process they went through. And then hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit about my own process and also representing adoptees in Minnesota. But Courtney, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, say a little bit about who you are and kind of why you're here.
Okay, thanks, Greg. It's so nice to see so many people on here, 58 participants, I think, as of now. So that shows you how much interest there is in this topic. So unlike Rudy, I am new to the advocacy world. In fact, I petitioned the courts in Georgia last year. So my original birth certificate is hot off the press, I guess you could say, since I got it just in December. So my little intro is a little bit more personal. Just wanted to share with you my story, let you know where I was raised and kind of why I decided to do this journey and this search. So I was born Christmas morning, 1978 in Augusta, Georgia. And it's a small town about 2 hours east of Atlanta. About 3 days later, I was placed in a foster care home and named Angela, probably something to do with Christmas and angel, I don't know. But anyway, I was there. Then I went to live with my adoptive family in April of 1979. So about 5 months after I was born, I went to live with them. I wasn't formally adopted until December 14th, 1979. So I was always curious about my biological family. I just wanted to know where I came from, who they were, what they looked like, and I really wanted to meet them one day. So in 2010, after I had my twin girls in 2009, I decided to start the journey. So I registered on the International Soundex Reunion Registry, ISRR, you probably know about that. But I didn't get anything. So there was nothing on there, nothing that could provide me with any information. So it wasn't until about 2014 that I discovered Georgia Adoption Reunion Registry. And I think we have a link to that website, Greg. But it's an organization that's funded by Families First out of Georgia. It was set to help or assist birth parents and adoptive children impacted by adoption or affected by adoption is what their website says. So they opened up in about 1990, but I didn't know anything about them until 2014, as I said. So I paid them a fee to find my birth mother. They pay per person fee to locate a birth parent. So I paid them a fee. They are able to pull birth certificates from the sealed state of Georgia. So they gave me her name. Unfortunately, my birth parents were both deceased at the time of my search. So I never got to meet them. They did not know my birth father's name for sure because his signature wasn't on any of the documentation. So really what I had was my birth mother at that point. Then I reunited with my maternal side, my maternal aunt, and they provided verbally with information about my story. So since I still didn't know my birth father in 2018, I signed up for all the DNA sites. 23andMe, which I had no luck on, and then Ancestry. Well, in March of 2018, I get this message from a cousin saying basically, who the heck are you? I want to know who you are. And I had already done my research, so I knew she was on the paternal side, and that was the side I hadn't found. So I thought, yes, this is incredible. I'm going to have answers. And lo and behold, that's where I found the name of my birth father. So that's what verified my paternal side is through DNA. And then in 2019, somebody on Georgia Adoption Reunion Registry's website posted that an attorney out of Atlanta had great luck in petitioning the courts in Georgia in finding records. And I thought, this is too good to be true. Everybody I know in Georgia who's an adoptee has never had any luck. And they're locked and sealed. I mean, I just hadn't heard those types of stories. So I was very skeptical. I reached out to Lila Bradley. And by the way, she serves the entire state of Georgia. So if you were born in a different part of Georgia, she can help you too. But I reached out to her and decided to just go for it, to pay her the flat fee and get all the paperwork that I deserve to have in my hands. So we signed the documentation and filed the petition in July of 2020, and I received my final paperwork in December of 2020. So it was about a 6-month process. And that was during COVID too, when lots of courts were closed and probably still are. And so she said, actually, that was a little bit longer than usual. So it could be a little bit faster in the future. So that's my story in a nutshell. To tell you about my birth parents, my birth mother was a home economics teacher, and my father was superintendent of schools, an elected position. They were not married. She was 37 or 38, I'm sorry. He was 54. And I just think society at the time, being unwed, they felt like that was a challenge, and therefore put me up for adoption. And I was the only child I think either of them ever had, as far as I know at this point. So that's my story. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, Courtney. If anyone has questions for Courtney or Rudy as we're going through, please just put them in the chat or just hold them until we're done, because we hope to have at least 15 minutes, if not more, for questions. The idea is we'll go to 4 o'clock my time, and then we'll extend beyond there depending upon the number of questions that we have. But we'll break off no matter what, an hour and a half in, about 4:30 Central. Let me tell you a little bit about both my experience and experience with representing adopted people. My experience was in the District of Columbia, where I was born and adopted. And in the year 2000, I petitioned the court in DC, and what they call the petition is a petition to break seal. And within maybe a couple of weeks, I got an order from the court saying, yes, we've broken the seal. And I thought, oh, this is awesome. I can't wait. I'm going to get my records. But that's not the way it works. And you get a notice from the agency that handled your adoption, and they say, we will now do search services for you, reunion search services, and determine if your parents want to release your records. And I didn't want, I wanted my information. I didn't want a reunion or search of any kind. I just wanted my records. And I was new at finding out at age 30 something that I had 2 birth certificates. I never knew that. And so I just sat on it for another, about another 15 years. Didn't do anything. And then I finally, as an attorney, in 2015, I filed a court case. And this time, and maybe Rudy and Courtney can talk about this as well, I was very careful in the precise documents that I was seeking. And I said, I was very particular to say, this is what I want: a birth record, I want court records, and I want agency records. And I was very clear on what standards applied to each one of those. And most carefully, I was distinguished between the birth record, which is a vital record, is independent of adoption. It's not an adoption record. And the standard for releasing a birth record in DC was different from the standard of releasing, for instance, agency records. And so that's one question that you have to wrestle with as we talk about adoption records or getting your records. You really need to distinguish between what records you're talking about, because there may be legal standards that are different for each set. And I've always said that there's 3 sets of records. There's actually quite a few more than 3 sets, but the main 3 sets are the birth record, which for the most part is one of the easier ones to get. And I know you laugh at that description, but it's true when you compare it to court records, which are a little harder to get. And then you have agency records, which have the most valuable information and the most information about your early life. And they're the absolute hardest records to get for various reasons. And usually there's a different standard, or it's a private organization that holds the records. And sometimes it's a religious organization, and for religious reasons, they may not release them as well. And a court does not like to order a private organization to release records. So that's one thing. I'd love each of you, if you can, talk about what records you actually received, what were you hoping to get, in that process of trying to get those. And I will say I do the same thing in Minnesota when I represent individuals, is we are very careful to distinguish which records we want, or my client wants: birth record, court records, and agency records. And I almost always say, listen, we're probably not going to get agency records. I just want you to know that up front, because it's unlikely that they're going to order the adoption agency to release them. So I'll turn it over to Rudy to talk more about the process you went through. And then we'll again come back to Courtney about the process that she went through with having an attorney represent her in court. So go ahead, Rudy.
Thank you, Greg. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. And I think Greg did make a good point. I actually went after all documents that Greg had described. I later pursued my family home study and all records on file with my adoption agency. That happened after I got my original birth certificate. I also pursued all the records that were on file with my adoption agency at the time I first got my records in 1989. And I went to the state of Michigan to actually petition for my original birth certificate in 2016. So I have been doing this off and on since 2016 through every available channel, where all of my records about my identity and about my parents are kept and withheld from me for reasons that are not, I think, based in a rational system of applying fairness to those who are born as adoptees. One of the things I want to also share is, I did this as an individual. And I think part of the process when one goes about this is it's an individual choice, but there has to be some sort of internal process that one has to confront as to what they're doing and why they're doing it. Courtney gave a description of what was important to her. My process began when I was in my young 20s. I began that process, and I never, one thing that stuck with me throughout my life is I never accepted no. I didn't believe no was an acceptable answer. I believe the entire process was immoral and wrong, and in my view, probably illegal as I define what law should represent for people and kind of the treatment of people. So that helps me in my process, because I never acknowledged the morality and the legality of the system. That carried me through on my darkest days, and everyone's going to have a process that they go through when they are told no. And not only told no, but told no repeatedly, consistently, constantly, if in my case it was for decades. The other thing I did was I approached this as a strategy. My court process was one of many. When I found my birth families when I was 24. My birth mother was living in Michigan, and I was able to work with her to sign a legal consent form. And that legal consent form required the state and the adoption agencies to release to me my records. The state, for its own rationale and system, decided that my OBC was not a document that could be released, and it required a court order, and I didn't get it. I got my medical records and other records about my early life, and I learned some things I didn't know, like I was rushed to an emergency room my first week of life, and I could have passed away at that time. There are things that were being withheld from me, which I could have had and never got until I got my birth mother to sign that consent form. So, as with all of us, we have to go and we live our life, and I just couldn't keep pursuing this day in and day out, so I let it go. And then it was later in 2014 when I met my half sister, because I was still continuing to learn about my families, that I decided it was time that I would write a book about my process, because I finally felt my story was more complete. And in the process of writing that book, I realized I still had this one last fight, and this last fight was going to be about the critical document, which I believed I was entitled to by law and was being denied for reasons that were arbitrary and capricious. So I went into this, I learned some lessons. Some of these are, the Michigan government isn't there to help. The courts really aren't there to help. The media, who were engaged at all steps in the way, were not very sympathetic to my story. I contacted more than 4 dozen media in 3 different states to highlight every aspect of my court process. Only one reporter contacted me and told me on the phone that she believed my mother had a right to privacy and I didn't have a right to my records, which I thought was noteworthy. And I'm not surprised, unfortunately, but that's the reality of our life's journeys and our struggles. And I had to rely on myself. Again, it was just me dealing with this. So because it was just me, I decided I was going to take a strategy of becoming the most annoying thing possible and be like a tsetse fly. I don't know if you've ever seen a tsetse fly, but they are ferocious critters in Africa. They take a chunk of flesh out of you when they bite, and they make some of the largest animals in the world run around, just like they're completely out of control of their ability to control the situation. So that was my strategy. I was going to do a 2-prong approach. I was going to go after my records to the estate, and then if that didn't work, I was going to go after the court. And by basically keeping everything in the public eye, by contacting the media, by writing letter after letter after letter, they were going to remain distracted, and they were finally just going to give up. It's not because they liked me or it's because they believed that they weren't going to win. They just finally said, let's just get rid of him. And that's really what ended up happening. So I had to go to the court. First of all, I went to the state of Michigan, went straight to the top. I ignored all the low-level bureaucrats. I rode straight to the head of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I was rejected. So I got a nice rejection letter from the state saying, basically, even though you indicate you already have been able to obtain facts about your birth, in order for us to release a copy of this original sealed original, a court will still need to release the record. So I've known my birth family for 27 years. I've known both sides of those families. I've met them, and the state of Michigan said, you still don't get your original birth certificate, even though theoretically nothing on that document is not known to me at this point for nearly 3 decades of my life. Next step of the process was I had to go to the 3rd Circuit Court Juvenile Division. That's the court that handles adoption. So I had to do a petition process. So you get these pieces of papers, and then you have to file your fees. You have to file forms. You have to basically go through a court process. That court process was not clear. It was very opaque. I filed my petition. So I made my petition in March of 2016 to the state. I was rejected. I next went to the court in April, filed my paperwork with them, multiple forms. And at that point, it was not clear how the court was going to put me on their docket. Even what it was not clear when the judge would hear me. It wasn't even clear if I had to be there in person. Luckily, to my benefit, I was able to do this by phone. I couldn't afford an attorney. I couldn't afford to fly. I couldn't afford to leave my job at the time. So it was sort of luck that this happened. The thing that I found that worked is when you are going through the courts and these petitioning processes, you establish a personal relationship with the people who actually get the things done in the courts. So I developed a first name relationship with someone there who was the administrator. And I just kept being polite, but very firm and very tsetse fly-ish, that I was not going to be easily dismissed. So she said, well, we'll let you know. And then I would write back and say, I actually need something better than that. I need a date. I need a time. I need to know whether or not this is going to go into the docket. She told me that a judge was on vacation. We'll get back to you. I would reply. I would send it certified mail. That's always a good trick for those out there who work in the legal system, is to let them know that everything is happening. And also in my case, At the same time, I was also letting the state of Michigan know that I was doing this, and I did this by doing a FOIA request. So I did a records request for all records about me as I was approaching my court date, which was finally set for June 17th. That was meant to let the court, not the court, but the state know that I had them on notice, that I was watching them closely, that the records that they were writing about me in email were going to be public record, and that they really couldn't, I guess, continue a strategy of basically saying, no, we will just not take into account the facts on that you've presented, and we'll just say no. So I was letting them know that I was going to continue to be an annoyance to them in a very public way, to the degree which I could. My process in the court lasted exactly 7 minutes long. The judge was Judge Dingle, who's part of the dynasty in Michigan of the Dingle clan. And the judge basically was on the phone, and the judge basically began the process by stating what he considered to be the relevant facts, that I knew that my name had changed, that I knew what my original birth name was, that my birth mother legally, and in terms of a consent form, had not objected to the releasing of this document. He was most particularly interested in the status of my birth father, who was never a part of my life and denied paternity from the entire time I came into being. He was really uncertain as to whether or not he clearly was dead, even though I had produced news stories to that account. And then finally, he basically stated that he had to show good cause, which is an issue that we have to document, even though he stated during the process he didn't even know what good cause meant. And he stated his objection and anger at the state legislature, that the state legislature didn't even define what good cause meant, so he couldn't even determine why he could release my original birth certificate. And then I was asked to give a statement as to why I deserve this information. So there I am, 51 years into my process, 27 years into my process of requesting records, asking to give a single statement why I deserve my birth record. It is a very unusual situation to be in. It's not fair. It seems completely ridiculous. And in my case, it seems existentially absurd that I actually have to do this, that I still have to continue to provide information why I deserve my original birth certificate, but I did it. And I just basically said that I'm going to have it in my record. This information is nothing new. This information is a document that already has publicly available information that I've been sharing publicly for decades now. This is a matter of me closing a chapter in my life, addressing an issue which I think is of importance. And then he basically said, I agree with the petitioner. We're going to release his record. If anyone disagreed, they could appeal the process. And then he said, what we'll do is we'll send you a document that will then allow you to present that to the vital records. At this point, we are out of it. It's up to you to finish the job. So that was a bit sort of interesting, that he basically said, we're going to let you actually get that record and we're not going to have anything to do with it. So he sent me this, which was a one-page order. And that's what I got from the judge. I then sent that order to Vital Records. And then Vital Records, I then, of course, had to do something like this, which is send this massive tome, which is all these records and documents, why they had to release it with the judge's orders. They then refused to give it to me. And they said, we don't understand the judge's order. The judge's order makes no sense. So I immediately contacted the judge's office, and the clerk there said, well, we'll sort of intervene. So they intervened. And then, lo and behold, on July 16, I finally got this, which is, I've whited out some areas here, which is my original birth record. So that only took 27 years after I found my birth family. That was a frustrating process, but it's how it worked. And again, this type of process is restricted to those who are born in the donut hole years, which Greg had described, which is 1945 to 1980. Which are the most restrictive. And I'm going to argue one other thing here, or share one other perspective with you, that a battle for a birth certificate is not a battle for a birth certificate entirely. It's a symbolic battle. It is a tool by which those who are working in our adoption system to promote adoption. And it's as a powerful symbol. Symbols are always something we fight over. And it's in this battle over this symbol that I think that these records are being denied to us. It's in this battle for this document that those who are promoting and advancing the the interest of those who are promoting adoption, want to exert control over adoptees, who are the ones who should have the greatest voice in the national discussion. So I just would argue that it's not just about you, it's about other things. And this is a symbol, and it's important when these things happen, when these documents are released. But we have to, again, situate this and understand this as part of a national process, which again, many of these people are working on to change. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudy. And then we'll come back for questions and answers. And a lot of things there to actually talk about that I will also try to mention a little bit when I talk about my experience. But Courtney, why don't you talk about the process you went through being represented by an attorney? I'll put a link up to the attorney's webpage. I don't know many attorneys that ever handle these cases. And in fact, I try to get attorneys in other states to do it. And I think it's a matter of not understanding the law, but also there's not a lot of money in it. And money is something that attorneys, you know, that's their business and they need to be paid for it. So I'd be curious to know also if you're comfortable sharing what the cost was as well to you financially in getting those records. So go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think people need to know that going into all this, what to expect. I'll talk specifically about the 6 months of last year that Lila Bradley helped me get my records. So I contacted her, as I said, in February of 2020. She's with the firm, and I think you're putting it up there, of Claiborne,
Yep.
Fox, Bradley, and Goldman in Atlanta. And I said before, too, that she serves the entire state of Georgia. So if you were born in other cities throughout the state of Georgia, she can help you as well. She said there may be some travel fees associated, some extra travel fees, but she can definitely help you. So she explained to me what we would be doing. We would be petitioning the departments in Georgia. There are 3 different departments: the Department of Children and Family Services, Vital Statistics, and Department of Human Services. So she would petition these courts where my adoption was finalized. Luckily, when I was 18, my parents gave me all of my adoption paperwork. So they had in there the final decree of adoption and my non-identifying information and so forth. So I knew the county where the adoption was finalized. And so the cost to petition the state of Georgia was $1,500. If the court was incorrect, if for example, you gave the attorney a different county than you thought it was, there would be extra fees associated with petitioning other court systems. So we talked about, you know, is this feasible? I mean, is Georgia going to give me my records? And she said, you know, she had a very successful petition rate, I guess, if you want to call it, and had been very successful with helping adoptees in all different scenarios. She says one thing that the judges really like to see is that the person had been through Georgia Adoption Reunion Registry. They'd gone through the state's program of getting information. So luckily, you know, a couple of years prior, I had done that. It was $300 to get the name of my birth mother. So she said that would make our petition look a little bit better to the judges because they wanted you to go through their system. And I know Florida, for example, I think somebody on here was from Florida. There's a Florida Adoption Reunion Registry in that state as well. So I would imagine that that's kind of the same scenario there. So early in July, we began collecting all of my paperwork. So the non-identifying information, the adoption decree, proof I utilized Georgia Adoption Reunion Registry, you know, emails to social workers, et cetera, and then my post-adoption birth certificate. So those were the items that she would send as what am I trying to think of the word, as exhibits with the petition. So we sent this off on July 23rd. She did warn me that the process was going to be a little bit slower because of COVID last year. But only 2 months later, we heard from the judge's office. And we heard that they wanted to set a hearing. And I, not knowing any legal, any of this, I said, what the heck is that? And are we going to still have a good opportunity to petition the courts? So basically what a hearing is it gives the departments a chance to respond with any objections. It also gives the judges the opportunity to ask questions if they want to. So of course I started freaking out. I mean, that made me pretty nervous. And it made me also think, well, this isn't going to happen. If she's going to do a hearing, then, that means she probably isn't going to approve these petitions. So we followed up a couple days prior, because Lila said this really isn't common practice to schedule a hearing. So let me follow up with the judge's office and see what exactly they want to accomplish in this. So of course, when did we hear back from them? But one day before the scheduled hearing, and the scheduled hearing was going to be on Zoom. So one day before the hearing, the judge's office emailed us and said, no hearing. I am approving the petitions and ordering those departments to produce your files. So that was a great day. It just, I was just so overjoyed. So I'm going to try to pull up a couple things here. Let me try to pull up the petition so I can show you what exactly that looked like. And tell me if you can see it or not. Can you see it? Yes? Okay. So this is the petition to unseal adoption records. It was in DeKalb County. That's when my adoption decree was finalized on December 14th, 1979. It had a portion in there that my adoptive parents were okay with me petitioning the courts. On a side note, I don't even think they knew I was petitioning the courts, but we went ahead and put that in there. They've been supportive of the journey throughout anyway. It also shows that we went through Georgia Adoption Reunion Registry. I found out who my birth mother was, when she passed away, that I was in reunion with my maternal aunt, and then she passed away, and that they could not find information on my biological father at that point. So that's saying it in here, the reason for me looking. Let's see if we scroll down. Oops. Okay, here we go. So to kind of summarize the petition, if you look under 10, it says petitioner shows that her adoptive parents are aware of her desire to unseal adoption records. So I think that's a reasoning that they put in these petitions. Both biological parents are deceased. Somebody had asked if you have a greater chance if they're deceased rather than living. And I don't know. I think that would be a question to Lila Bradley on the success she's had with that circumstance. In that I'm already in contact with my biological mother's family, telling the courts, hey, she already knows who these people are. Let's just give her the records. And then, of course, that my request is based on a deep personal desire to know more about my origins and family history. And granting the request will not adversely affect any individual. And of course, we know that they're very concerned about it impacting the adoptive family or the biological family. And then this is just the notice of the Zoom conference, the hearing that was going to be scheduled that never happened. So this is what a petition looks like. It's your name versus that certain department. Okay, so I'm gonna exit out of here. Okay. So a lot of people say, okay, well, what's in these documents that you got? I mean, was it worthwhile to do this? And I found that it really was. I got about 100 pages of paperwork. So the first department I heard back from was Department of Human Resources. So that included all of the adoption paperwork, the final decree, which I already had, the petition for adoption by my adoptive parents, the paperwork that my birth mother signed to surrender me for adoption, and then the paperwork related to my birth father not signing the forms. And that was speculated as to why my adoption took a little bit longer, because he didn't want to sign the forms. I think he knew all the judges in the area, so he was kind of concerned that word would get out that I was around. And then let's see, it also included an order terminating the birth father's rights in October of 1979, and then of course my formal adoption paperwork. So none of it was really earth-shattering new, but it was all the documents related to my adoption. Then in November 2020, I was actually on a family vacation with my kids and getting ready to go on this ride. And I looked down, my phone dings, and I have an email from Lila, and it's my original birth certificate. Here I am with my kids getting ready to go on a ride, and I'm looking at my original birth certificate for the first time. It was a weird situation, but oh my gosh, just life-changing. It was the first document that I was holding in my hands that verified my birth date, the time of birth, how much I weighed. I found out what hospital I was born at. I did discover that I wasn't named, which I think was a common back then. So it did just say baby girl. And it had the correct city where I was born. The amended birth certificates has the place where you grew up and your adoptive parents' names. So this had all the true information I was literally holding in my hands. It was amazing. So got the birth certificate. Then in December 2020, I received the final paperwork from the Department of Children and Family Services. Now, this is what I really, 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 really wanted. I wanted to find out where I was for those 5 months of my first 5 months of my life. I just couldn't wrap my head around that nobody knew where I was, who I was with. And I just had to know. This was the black hole of the story. This was the missing piece. So in this paperwork, it had all of the paperwork from the social workers telling everything about my adoptive parents, my brother, the home life situation. They had site visits for months and months while I was in foster care to my adoptive parents. It talked about their jobs, describing them and what they like to do. It also had in their site visits to go see me when I was in my foster care home. It was interesting. One of the things that Greg and I was talking about the other day is how much emphasis they put on looks back then with social workers. And throughout all of the site visit notes, there were several questions to my adoptive parents. She is quite a plump baby. Plump. I couldn't believe that the social workers actually used that word. And plump baby, are you sure you want to have a plump baby like this? You're very petite yourself. Anyway, it was weird. And then they said, are you sure you're okay with a redhead? They asked that several times. And of course, my parents and the responses were, sure, yes, we're fine with it. We're fine with it. But it was mostly about looks, which I just found interesting at the time. Let's see. I found out that my transitions to my foster home and my adoptive family home, I had a hard time. I had a couple weeks of crying and nightmares and things like that. So that was all notated in those site visits. It did show that I received good pediatric care when I was in my foster home and in my adoptive home. And so that's another thing I wanted to know. Did I get the routine shots? Did any pediatrician ever see me during that time? So those type things were answered. It even told what type of formula I was drinking, etc. And then it had all of the social information for my birth mother's parents, her 9 siblings, my birth father and his 2 siblings, height, weight, age, hobbies, occupation, all of that. So that was a couple of pages of paperwork too. So that being said, in those records, I never found information about where I was or who I was with during those first 5 months. I asked the attorney. I said, you know, why isn't that in there? It seems like an important piece of the paperwork, and just some things are sometimes omitted. And so unfortunately, I never did find out. The only descriptive part of that is I know the county where I was in, and it coincides the stories that I've heard from the birth family. So I think I know roundabout where I was, but I have no clue as to who I was with. So that was the whole process of getting the files last year. It was about 100 pages, and it's, you know, I hold in my hands, I read through it, and it's about my life. It's my they're my documents. I mean, I should have these, and I think we all deserve the right to have our own files, and it's our truths, you know, it's our beginnings. So I just hope that with this call we can help others, encourage you guys to petition the courts, and maybe the more courts that are being petitioned, and we start hammering them with all these requests, and then they'll say, fine, we'll open the gates and you can have your files without petitioning. So
Well,
that's
you know,
maybe so one day.
thanks, Courtney. I mean, that's a really good point, though, because one of the reasons why I bring these cases on behalf of adopted people in Minnesota is it educates the judiciary on how broken the law really is. And I'll post an affidavit. I have it here that I used it first used one in 2017, almost 4 years ago, and it's from an affidavit from a search angel, and a search angel lays out my client's essentially DNA case, and we say to the court, all right, we can either go through these 40, 50, 200 contacts through DNA, or don't you think it'd be better to just release the birth record and the court records? And in every case, the courts have agreed. And so we're presenting to the courts, the judiciary, which of course talks to the legislature, what's happening in reality. And that reality needs to be forwarded to the legislature. We try in legislation to tell them what the reality is. We try to convince them that this is a right that we should have to have our own birth record. You know, they're listening to other political arguments that often deny that right. And so I think it's a very important point to try to petition the courts if you can, if it doesn't cost too much money, because it can be very expensive, depending upon the attorney willing to take the case. And it's a great way to pursue this avenue. And that's essentially why I did it in DC. I did it in DC because, I mean, I knew all my information. I knew who my parents were, but I wanted my record. I wanted my birth record. And while I was at it, I asked for the court records and the agency records. And like you, I got agency records, and I got 77 pages, which are just extraordinary, and are often the hardest documents. So you're incredibly lucky to get 100 pages of agency records, because that really outlines where, you know, maybe not where you were those first 5 months, but how you came to be an adopted person. And I think a lot of people don't understand that deep desire to know. For me, it was the 7 days that I was in a maternity home. What was that like? Who drove me to the agency, to my new parents? I wanted all that information, and I was able to get that from the agency records. But the problem is agency records are the hardest ones to get, but have the most valuable information. So yeah, I agree that petitioning a court is a great avenue. It's a limited avenue because you're not going to change the law generally for everybody. It's a very personal avenue. But I think with continuing to hammer the courts, as you say, we may be able to influence the legislation. We may be able to come across a case that would set precedent. We may be able to come across a case that sets the birth record as a civil right. And you know, I think there are people in the adoptee rights community that deny that we have these rights to a birth record. Say, where's the right? They ask, where's the right? And it's like, well, let's examine these broad identity rights. And that's why, you know, in the other sense, we need to create allies with other communities that have these same identity rights or identity issues. So the donor conceived people who have who need to have this broad right of identity. After all, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children has a very broad identity right for children. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not a signatory, or it has not is not a party to that convention. We're the only country in the world that's not a party to that convention. But I do use that argument in court because it's a valid argument. And so I think we're dealing with the courts as an equal rights issue, but we're also trying to educate the courts so that they also bring that issue over to the legislature, or I can testify as to what's happening in the courts. And this is what's happening in the courts, and your system is broken. You need to fix it. So I'll also, so that's why I essentially do what I do. I do it almost pro bono. I've begun to charge a flat fee now, usually less, $500 or less. The alternative for people in Minnesota is that they have to pay $1,000 to the adoption agency for a search that may end up with the result of, sorry, we couldn't find your birth parent, you get nothing. And so it's a lot more cost effective to pay me $500 to represent someone on a flat fee in court than to pay the adoption agency and get nothing. And I've been fairly successful. And I think we're just behind the times. The courts are ahead because they see the facts, and the legislatures are behind because they see politics and 1950s adoptions, and we're way beyond that. I'm posting right now the forms that Minnesota uses. These are state court forms. It's a packet. I don't typically recommend the state court forms for one reason. They try to narrow what you can get. What I think they have a very narrow interpretation of the law and what the law can do. And so I draft my own petitions. And I'm also very careful in the petitions, and I've said this before, what records is at issue here? Birth records, court records, adoption agency records. I have a case where the baptismal certificate is important, and we're asking the agency to relinquish that the original one, certificate, and we've got an order to get it now. Whether they're going to give it to us, I don't know. We'll have to see. But these are what's broadly going on, and the day-to-day work on the ground, like Courtney and Rudy and myself are doing, is extremely important. But it's also often misunderstood what that it's both personal, but there is a politics involved in it. So I think what we'll do is we'll open up to questions and answers. I think there's a lot of questions that I've seen. I haven't been able to really keep up with them. And I apologize for that. It's hard to try to balance trying to see what's going on, but also answer the questions at the same time. But feel free, if you can, to raise your hand, and we'll get to those questions. Just to do that, on the computer, there's a reaction button, and on there is a raise hand. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll try to read some of them off the chat. Sometimes that's hard to do, but we'll try to get to those as well. And Rudy or Courtney, do you have any final thoughts or comments?
My final comment is, as you mentioned, Greg, I do think those adoption records issues are big, and the access to them matters. And particularly as for those in our cohort, many of our parents have passed away, and we will never know their stories. It was actually only by petitioning the adoption agency I was able to get a single document released from them. This was after I got my OBC that indicated for instance, my adoptive mother and father were actually looking into adopting a third child. No one had ever told me that story. And it's those records which we will never know, were never spoken about, which only now reside in some warehouse of some large system. And that's where they are. And it's unfortunate we can't get them. And it's unfortunate adoptees are told to go to court. Thanks.
Yeah. We'll get right to the questions. Lisa, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
So Greg, I'm a DC adoptee, and I guess I always heard if it's a closed adoption, it's a closed adoption. What you're saying is that not necessarily, that record isn't sealed, forever gone.
Right. I guess my answer to that is no state has a forever sealed record. They're all, at least every state has a court order provision, and that's what DC has. And I just put up a link to sort of my efforts in DC. What happens in DC, and it's a federal district, so you're subject to essentially federal law, although now they're, they have home rule. But you petition the court to unseal, it's $80. You fill out a petition that they provide. I don't like the petition. I have a sample petition on my blog that kind of walks through what you need to be careful about in asking for the records, because they don't distinguish between what records you want. And so if you say, I want adoption records, they'll think of agency records, and they'll deny the whole thing. But they always break the seal. They always have an order to break the seal. And then you get a letter in the mail from the adoption agency saying, hi, I'm your social worker, and I'll be working with you to find your birth parents. It's like, well, I didn't ask for that. I asked to know what I asked to get my documents, and not, I don't want reunion and not ready for it. I don't want to pay you $500 for this without any knowledge of I'll have results. And the idea is you pay the search service to the agency. They look for the birth parent, and they used to be able to have the consent of the birth parent. And that was part of the case that I had that went up to the DC Court of Appeals. And the DC Court of Appeals said, no, it's not dependent upon the consent of the birth parent. The paramount concern is the adopted person. The statute is very clear about that. So they no longer require consent in DC. And this is another example of why court record or court cases can change the law. But they have to obtain the input of birth parents. I'm not quite sure what that means. I haven't seen any cases come out of DC since my case. So it's an ongoing issue. But it is a little easier now, and the consent is not the be all end all in DC anymore. The other thing they did in my case, and why it was so motivating for me, is I knew everybody. I knew who my birth father was. I was in reunion with my birth mother. I inherited all her records. I, had love letters between my birth parents. They later married, but she was deceased, and my birth father I knew, but we're not in reunion. And the court denied my request to get an unredacted birth record. And the agency records were also redacted, but all it meant was I just look at where it's redacted and fill in a name. So I had to appeal the redaction, and they agreed and said, no, you need to be unredacted. I will say too, that when we went back to court after the appeal, I think Rudy talked with me about this as well when we were talking earlier, make sure you don't make enemies of the court staff. They are critical. And they were behind me like almost 100%. They're kind of cheering for me in some ways. They thought, this is stupid for this guy to come from Minneapolis to DC and appear before the court. And so they were really happy to see the court hand over the records to me at the hearing. But yeah, I think it's possible in DC. What will affect it is if the parent is deceased, and whatever input the birth parent provides, if the birth parent's even found. I mean, if they're not found, what's the input there? I think if they're not found, I think the proper course is to release the records.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
You have no idea.
Oh, good. Great. Yeah, and get in touch with me too. I mean, just find my email, because I know that I can't represent people in DC. I wish I could. It would be just like a perfect extension for me, because I know it so well. But I could certainly give you general information of what to look out for.
Yeah, and in the case of my adoption agency, it has been closed, and I know where the records have been moved,
Right.
but I was not good at getting contact with the new agency.
Right. Yeah, and that's often a problem, is where did the records go? They're required to find another agency to handle them, or give them back to the government agency that handles them. But sometimes they're lost. or there's a flood or locusts or a windstorm that took them away. So thanks, Lisa. And Meredith, why don't you have a question or a hand up? Why don't you unmute and ask? Go ahead. Oh.
Sure, thank you. I heard some great comments about good cause. My state's Massachusetts, and they're a good cause to unseal records. I was trying to see if anyone else had some good thoughts on how to make that argument, because I don't believe it's defined by the state in Massachusetts either. And it does seem a little ridiculous that I have to show good cause to get my own records because they're my records, but I don't think that's really going to be a good argument.
And then, so you must be born prior to 1974.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was able to get my original birth certificate. So I'm kind of like, I know who my biological parents are, and they're both deceased. I just want the records. I want to know what happened. I want the home studies. I want to know my story,
So so you want the agency records, and you need good cause for those?
Yes. And I also want I don't even have my adoption certificate. I don't even have that.
Oh, the court records. So yeah. So the one thing I had to do in DC, which I did not like doing it at all. So I wanted agency records. I was really keen on getting agency records, which I'm blown away that Courtney was able to get them. I was kind of not clever, but as a lawyer, I created affidavits for my adoptive parents that in the affidavit said something along the lines of, I don't believe my adult son needs my permission to obtain his own records, but to the extent that he does, I give full permission for him to do so. So I wasn't giving up this argument that I needed their permission. I was saying that, if that's what you want, we'll give it to you, but we don't think he needs to give it to you. I don't know if you have issues of you can get consent from people, because part of the problem with agency records is that there is a social work component there. They're talking with people confidentially about their present circumstances at the time. And that's, I think, why courts are often reluctant to release home studies, for instance, in which they're really analyzing the adoptive parents. Or there's really often not a lot of information in the agency records about the birth parents. It's mostly about the adoptive parents. And I think that's why I needed the adoptive parent consent. But I think that's what you're going to run up against, is either having to prove that they're deceased or show that they are okay with releasing all the records, unfortunately, until the law changes.
Both adoptive parents and biological parents are deceased. So there's no one left that's going to be disturbed by this information.
Right. I think there, in most places, including Minnesota, anywhere, you're going to have to make a broad argument about the right to full identity and heritage, that you should have that right. And you could possibly use the UN Convention. You could try to find other legal avenues to show that this identity right is a right that you should have and provides good cause. DNA doesn't really help you in that situation, actually.
No, I've already connected through DNA. So
right.
Yeah. That happened to me.
Right. It's another ridiculous example of the hoops and the humiliation that you have to go through in order to get very basic information about your own history.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Sure. No problem. Any other questions I haven't been able to, at this point, to monitor the chat. So I'll let you know we do save the chat, and we don't publish it anywhere. But we will go through it, and we will follow up after this session today. And we usually send out all the links in an email to everybody who signed up. So you have all the links that we've posted, and then we'll pick out some of the issues too that were discussed and possibly add a little bit more detail on those issues. Anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I think we're at 4:15, which is kind of where I wanted to end it on. I would for those who are allies to intercountry adoptees or are intercountry adoptees, I'd encourage you for our next event that we'll be walking through the current law that impacts intercountry adoptees and U.S. citizenship. We'll also talk about what can be done to change that law. And then a follow-up to that one is similar to this one, how do you get your own records? It's interesting that when the fiction, and generally there's really no fiction involved in an adoption that's intercountry. You look at, if you're coming from Korea, for instance, to a white family, there's no fiction that you were as if born to that white family. And so obtaining the records is much easier for intercountry adoptees. You just make what is called the Freedom of Information Act request to USCIS, and you get whatever adoption records exist in the file. Sometimes there's a certificate of abandonment. Sometimes there's a actual birth certificate from the country of origin. There's there's home studies, there's tax returns, there's state issued documents that approve the adoption and why. There's just a whole range of information because, and my theory is there's probably many theories, is that there is no fiction related to the adoption, and therefore the fiction falls apart. It also gets more complicated too because we treat intercountry adoptees as immigrants, and I think that may split sometimes the intercountry adoptee community. Are we an immigrant or is this a foreign policy issue? But I think that's also what's happening in that situation as well. But encourage those who are intercountry adoptees, allies to intercountry adoptees, to look at those next two events coming up. And then one in April, which deals with adoptees and donor conceived people. But otherwise, appreciate everyone coming, and we'll keep talking, keep doing these events. And I'll try to answer any other questions from the chat if I'm able to do that. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.